The reek of stale beer, piss, and something vaguely fishy clung to the air in the narrow alleyway off Thames Street, a familiar perfume to Thomas Fletcher. It was the scent of London's shadowed underbelly, the scent of his precarious existence. He leaned against the damp brick, a phantom in the encroaching twilight of a late autumn evening in the year of our Lord 1358. A shiver traced its way down his spine, not entirely from the cold. Waiting was always the worst part. A fleeting image, sharp and unwelcome, pricked his mind. His father's face, gaunt and defeated, the day the Baron's men had driven them from their small patch of land near Epping. The neat furrows they'd turned for generations, gone, replaced by the Baron's sheep. 12 silver coins, that's what his first desperate act had earned him, not for killing, not then, but for a piece of thievery so clumsy, it was a miracle he hadn't ended up swinging from a gibbet. Those 12 coins had tasted like ash, but they'd bought his mother a few more weeks of life. The ash taste had never quite left him. A flicker of movement at the alley's end, a stooped figure, cloaked and indistinct. The whisper. Thomas straightened, his hand instinctively moving to the worn hilt of the dagger tucked into his belt. Not out of aggression, but habit. In his world, surprise was a luxury you rarely survived. "You're late." Thomas kept his voice low, a gravelly murmur that wouldn't carry. The whisper chuckled, a dry, rasping sound like dead leaves skittering across cobbles. "Patience, Fletcher, a virtue, or so the priests would have us believe, though I doubt either of us has much truck with priests." He drew closer, the fishy smell intensifying. "I have a commission. Generous, for a man of your particular talents." Thomas said nothing. He knew the whisper's definition of generous. It usually meant just enough to make the risk almost worth it, and never a penny more. "A wool merchant," the whisper continued, his voice dropping even lower, though they were alone. "Master Alaric of Oakhaven. Grown fat on other men's fleeces and other men's wives, it said. He has displeased certain influential parties." Oakhaven, north, a long way from the relative anonymity of London. The price? 30 silver pieces, half now. The whisper's unseen hand extended a small heavy pouch. Thomas took it, feeling the familiar weight. 15 pieces. Enough to make him consider it. Enough to feed the gnawing worm of hope that one day he might have enough to truly disappear, to find a quiet place where the ghosts of his past wouldn't find him. A fool's dream, perhaps, but it was the only one he had left. "And Alaric?" Thomas asked. "He needs to retire, permanently." The whisper's tone was oily. "A man of his standing in a walled town like Oakhaven, it will require a delicate touch. Your specialty, I believe." Delicate. Thomas almost snorted. His work was anything but. It was brutal, messy, and terrifying. But he was good at the prelude, the watching, the waiting, the finding of cracks in seemingly solid walls. He nodded slowly. Oakhaven. Another name. Another handful of coins. Another piece of him chipped away. The journey north was a grim testament to the state of England. The roads were rutted tracks, plagued by mud and the constant threat of opportunistic bandits or starving, desperate men. Thomas travelled mostly on foot, his patched cloak pulled tight against the biting wind. He slept in haylofts when he could find them, the scratch of straw a familiar discomfort, or huddled in the lee of ancient hedgerows, the earth cold beneath him. He ate sparingly, a hunk of stale bread, a stolen turnip, water from streams that tasted of iron and damp earth. He skirted villages where the shadow of the great pestilence, though years past, still lingered in the wary eyes of the inhabitants and the too numerous fallow fields. Each coughing peasant, each shuttered cottage, was a reminder of how quickly life could be snuffed out, by disease or by a blade in the dark. His own cough, a dry, persistent hack he'd picked up in London's damp alleys, seemed to echo the general malaise of the land. During one particularly bleak stretch of moorland, a trio of rough-looking men armed with cudgels had tried to relieve him of his meagre possessions. Thomas hadn't hesitated. His dagger, honed to a razor's edge, moved with a desperate speed born of countless such encounters. 2 of them fled, nursing bleeding arms. The third lay still in the heather, his eyes wide with surprise. Thomas hadn't even bothered to search the body. There was rarely anything worth taking from men like that. He just wiped his blade on the damp grass and moved on, the metallic tang of blood in his nostrils. It was just another day. Oakhaven, when he finally reached it, was a proper walled town, its stone ramparts and sturdy gatehouse proclaiming a certain northern resilience. Smoke curled from 100 chimneys, and the air, though still carrying the autumn chill, was alive with the sounds of commerce, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the shouts of merchants in the market square, the rumble of cartwheels on the cobbled streets. Thomas slipped through the main gate with a group of farmers bringing their produce to market, his nondescript appearance and downcast eyes drawing no attention. He found a room in a squalid inn near the tanner's district, the stench of curing hides a constant acrid presence. It suited him. No one asked questions in places like this, as long as you paid your groat. For days, he became a shadow. He learned Master Alaric's routines, the merchant's morning walk to his warehouse by the river, his lengthy midday meal at the Boar's Head Tavern, his return to his large, well-guarded stone house on the edge of the wealthier quarter before nightfall. Alaric was a portly man, fond of ostentatious displays of his wealth, fine clothes, a gold chain around his thick neck, a retinue of surly-looking guards. He moved with an air of arrogant self-importance, cuffing aside beggars and barking orders at his underlings. Thomas watched, catalogued and planned. The merchant's house was formidable, stone walls, iron-barred windows on the ground floor, and at least 4 guards on duty at all times. But Thomas, from his patient observations, noted a small, seldom-used larder window at the rear, partially obscured by overgrown ivy. It was a possibility. A festering scratch on his forearm, a memento from a bramble patch he'd crawled through during his reconnaissance, began to throb painfully. He knew enough to fear such things. A small infection could kill as surely as a sword thrust. Remembering a sign he'd seen on the outskirts of town, he made his way to a small thatched cottage set back from the main road, a thin plume of smoke rising from its chimney. A simple wooden sign depicted a mortar and pestle. Alara, the herbalist, was a woman of indeterminate age, her face lined but her eyes clear and surprisingly direct. She moved with a quiet efficiency, her hands stained with the juices of plants, deft as she examined his arm. "This will need cleaning," she said, her voice soft but firm, "and a poultice. It's inflamed." Thomas merely nodded, offering no explanation for the wound. He paid her the few pennies she asked, his gaze lingering for a moment on the neatly arranged bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, the strange, not unpleasant scent that filled the small cottage. It was a world away from the stench of the tannery and the grim purpose that consumed him. Alara worked in silence, her touch surprisingly gentle. When she was done, his arm bandaged neatly with clean linen, he felt a peculiar, almost forgotten sensation, a flicker of human connection, quickly suppressed. He mumbled his thanks and left, melting back into the anonymity of Oakhaven's streets. The night of the storm was a gift. Wind howled through the narrow streets, driving sheets of rain that slicked the cobbles and sent townsfolk scurrying indoors. The guards outside Alaric's house huddled miserably in the shelter of the doorway, their vigilance undoubtedly compromised. Thomas, cloaked and rain-lashed, moved like a wraith towards the rear of the merchant's property. The larder window was stiff, but yielded to the pressure of his pry-bar with a soft groan, lost in the shriek of the wind. He slipped inside, landing silently on the cold stone floor. The air was thick with the smell of stored apples and smoked meats. He paused, listening. Only the drumming of rain and the distant howl of the storm. Navigating the darkened house was a matter of instinct and the memory of layouts he'd studied in countless similar ventures, a creaking floorboard here, a hanging tapestry there. He avoided the main staircase, knowing it would be watched, and instead found a narrow servant's stairwell. Alaric's bedchamber was opulent, heavy drapes muffling the storm's fury. A single candle guttered on a nearby table, casting long, dancing shadows. The merchant lay sprawled in his large bed, snoring softly, a fleshy mound beneath the expensive furs. Thomas moved with the silence he had cultivated over years of desperate survival. This was the point where the world narrowed to a single, terrible focus. No room for fear, no room for doubt, only the grim mechanics of the task. But Alaric, perhaps sensing a change in the room's atmosphere or a draught from the door, Thomas had eased open, stirred. His eyes blinked open, unfocused, then widened in dawning terror as he saw the dark figure standing by his bed. He tried to scream, a gurgling sound that was more a gasp. Thomas was on him in an instant, one hand clamping over the merchant's mouth, the other driving his dagger downwards. It wasn't clean. Alaric thrashed, his heavy body surprisingly strong. There was a sickening, wet sound, a brief, desperate struggle, and then stillness. The coppery scent of blood, sharp and familiar, filled the air. Thomas straightened, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He forced himself to be methodical. Alaric was known to keep a strong-box. He found it beneath the bed, a heavy iron-bound chest. It was locked, not part of the contract, but a desperate man took what opportunities arose. Using his pry bar again, he forced the lock with a grating shriek of metal that seemed deafening in the sudden quiet. Inside, among a scattering of coins, was a leather-bound ledger. Thomas almost dismissed it, but something about its careful construction, the way it was tucked beneath the coin bags, made him pause. He flipped it open. The candlelight revealed columns of names and figures, written in a neat, spidery hand. He couldn't make sense of it in the dim light, but it felt important, dangerous. He shoved it into his tunic along with the coins. Every instinct screamed at him to leave. The retreat was a blur of adrenaline and gnawing fear. He slipped out of Alaric's house the way he'd come, the storm still his accomplice, washing away his tracks, muffling any sounds. Back in his wretched room at the inn, he didn't sleep. He merely waited for the grey light of dawn, his senses stretched taut, listening for the first shouts, the inevitable hue and cry that would signal the discovery of Alaric's body. The town erupted as expected. Church bells pealed in alarm, not mourning. Guards clattered through the streets, their faces grim. Thomas, looking like any other drifter roused by the commotion, watched from a distance as officials and a stern-faced knight, Sir Callan, he would later learn the name, entered Alaric's house. He didn't linger. He gathered his few belongings, the ledger a heavy, illicit weight beneath his tunic, and slipped out of Oakhaven with a group of departing carters, just another anonymous face in the crowd. The rendezvous with the Whisper was set for 3 days later, at a ruined shepherd's bothy on the edge of the desolate Blackwood Moor, a good 2 days' ride south of Oakhaven. Thomas pushed himself, driven by the need to put distance between himself and the dead merchant and the equally pressing need for the rest of his payment. The wound in his arm, from the ambush that was yet to come, but which a lifetime of betrayals had taught him to anticipate in some form, throbbed with a dull ache. The bothy was a collapsing pile of stones, open to the sky, the wind whistling through its gaps. The Whisper was already there, a hunched shadow amidst the ruins. Punctual, the Whisper rasped, though his tone held no warmth. The task is done, I presume? Alaric is dead, Thomas stated flatly, his hand near his dagger. He didn't trust the silence of the moor, nor the man before him. Indeed, though the manner of it has caused some consternation, a degree of untidiness, I'm told. Thomas's eyes narrowed. Untidiness? And the matter of a certain ledger, the Whisper continued, his voice smooth as oil. An unforeseen complication, the patrons are displeased. So they knew. How? Had he been watched leaving Alaric's, or was this just another ploy? The price was for Alaric. The ledger is a separate matter. The Whisper chuckled, a dry, humourless sound. Perhaps, but your lack of discretion has reduced your value. Here. He tossed a small pouch. It landed with a meagre clink, lighter than it should be, significantly lighter. Consider it a retainer for future discretion, and a lesson learned. Rage, cold and sharp, surged through Thomas. This isn't what we agreed. Agreements change, Fletcher, as do circumstances. As the Whisper spoke, Thomas caught a flicker of movement from behind a crumbling section of wall. Ambush. He'd been a fool to expect anything else. He didn't wait. He lunged, not at the Whisper, but towards the direction of the movement, his dagger already in his hand. 2 men, burly and armed with short swords, burst from cover. The Whisper, meanwhile, simply faded back into the deeper shadows of the ruin, abandoning Thomas to his fate. The fight was desperate, brutal. Thomas was outnumbered, and the men were clearly expecting an easy kill. He used his speed, his knowledge of close-quarters fighting honed in countless alley brawls. He wounded one, a deep slash across the arm, sending the man staggering back with a howl. The other pressed him hard, their blades clashing in the dim light. Thomas felt a searing pain as the man's sword point grazed his ribs. He grunted, ducked under a wild swing, and drove his dagger up under the man's guard. A choked cry, and the man stumbled, collapsing. The first attacker, seeing his companion fall, hesitated just long enough for Thomas to whirl and kick out, catching him on the knee. The man went down with a yelp. Thomas didn't finish him. He was already bleeding from his side, his arms screaming in protest. He grabbed the meagre pouch of coins and fled, plunging into the tangled wilderness of Blackwood Moor, the sounds of pursuit, or what he imagined to be pursuit, echoing in his ears. News of Alaric's murder and the sensational theft of a ledger purported to contain secrets that could ruin half the prominent men in the north spread like wildfire. It reached the ears of Lord Ashworth, Sir Caelan's liege, a man whose name Thomas would have noted had he been able to decipher the ledger featured prominently within its pages. Ashworth, a man of cold ambition and even colder rages, summoned his knight captain. Sir Caelan stood before his lord, his expression unreadable. He was a man in his mid-30s, tall and powerfully built, his face stern, marked by an old sword scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, a testament to past campaigns in France. He was renowned for his unwavering loyalty, his skill in arms, and most pertinent to this situation, his relentless tenacity in pursuit of justice. "This assassin," Lord Ashworth spat, his face mottled with fury. "This gutter rat who dared to lay hands on Alaric and steal what is mine. I want him found, Caelan. I want him brought before me, and I want that ledger, whatever it takes." "I understand, my lord," Caelan replied, his voice calm but firm. "I have already begun inquiries in Oakhaven. The assassin was professional but not invisible. He left traces." "Traces are not enough." Ashworth slammed his fist on the heavy oak table. "I want his head, and that ledger. Its contents must not see the light of day. Do you comprehend the damage?" "Fully, my lord." Caelan's cold blue eyes met his lord's. "He will be found." And so the hunt began in earnest. Caelan, methodical and driven, started piecing together the assassin's trail. He spoke to the guards at Alaric's house, to the innkeeper where Thomas had stayed, even to the carters with whom Thomas had left Oakhaven. The description was vague, a quiet man, lean, unremarkable, but Caelan was like a bloodhound. He noted the direction of Thomas's flight, the timing of his departure. He learned of the ambush on Blackwood Moor from a terrified shepherd who had stumbled upon the aftermath. The assassin was wounded then. Good. Wounded men were slower, more desperate. They made mistakes. Thomas, meanwhile, was a hunted animal. His side wound was deep, and he'd done a poor job of stitching it with a stolen needle and some rough thread. It was inflamed, sending waves of fever through him. The coins from the Whisper were nearly gone, spent on scraps of food and a dirty bandage from a suspicious village peddler. The ledger, wrapped in oilskin, was a constant, dangerous weight against his aching ribs. He knew it was valuable, perhaps even more so than Alaric's life had been, but to whom? And how could he possibly use it without drawing even more attention to himself? He moved by night when he could, hiding in dense thickets or abandoned hovels during the day, his dreams filled with a confusing miasma of Alaric's dying face, his father's despair, and the cold, assessing eyes of the Whisper. Each distant hoofbeat, each barking dog, sent a jolt of fear through him. He was running out of time, running out of strength, running out of places to hide. He remembered Elara, the quiet herbalist with the steady hands and the scent of thyme and rosemary about her. Her cottage was isolated on the fringes of a small, insignificant village called Oak Hollow, not far from where the Blackwood Moor gave way to gentler farmland. It was a desperate gamble. She might turn him away, or worse, raise the alarm. But the fire in his side was consuming him, and the image of her calm competence offered a sliver of hope, however faint. He approached Oak Hollow like a wolf circling a sheepfold, wary and weak. The village seemed peaceful, untouched by the violent currents that swirled around men like him and Master Alaric. Elara's cottage stood apart, a plume of smoke rising invitingly from its chimney. He watched it for hours from the concealment of a copse of trees, battling his fever and his fear. Finally, as dusk began to settle, cloaking him in its familiar embrace, he stumbled towards her door. Elara opened it to find a spectre leaning against her doorframe. Gaunt, pale, his clothes torn and blood-stained, Thomas was a far cry from the quiet man who had sought her help for a minor scratch weeks ago. Her eyes widened, first in surprise, then in a dawning comprehension that made him flinch. Merciful heavens, she whispered, her gaze drawn to the makeshift bandage on his side, clearly soaked through. Help me, Thomas rasped, the words costing him a monumental effort. Please. For a moment she hesitated. He saw the conflict in her eyes, fear, pity, a natural caution. This was not a simple woodsman's injury, this was something darker, something dangerous. But then the healer in her won out. Inside, she said, her voice low, quickly. She helped him stumble to a rough cot in the corner of her small single-room cottage, the air thick with the scent of drying herbs. With practiced hands she cut away the filthy bandage. The wound was ugly, the flesh around it red and swollen, streaked with angry red lines. "This is bad," she murmured, her brow furrowed. "How did this happen?" Thomas shook his head, offering no explanation. "Can you?" "I can try," she said. "I have poultices and a willow bark infusion for the fever. But you need rest, and you need to be clean." For the next few days, Alara tended to him with a quiet diligence that astounded him. She cleaned his wound, applied soothing balms, and forced him to drink bitter fever-reducing brews. She asked few questions, and he offered no answers. A silent, uneasy truce settled between them. He was aware of the risk she was taking, harbouring a man in his condition. He saw the fear that sometimes flickered in her eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. Yet she continued to care for him. He learned to appreciate the small sounds of her life, the rhythmic chop of herbs, the soft whisper of her broom on the earthen floor, the gentle crackle of the fire in her hearth. They were sounds of peace, sounds he had almost forgotten existed. He kept the ledger hidden beneath the cot, a constant, guilty secret. Meanwhile, Sir Caelan's pursuit had not slackened. He had a night's disdain for moorland skirmishes and back-alley dealings, but his determination was absolute. He followed the faintest of trails, a discarded, bloodied rag here, a furtive inquiry about a man with a side wound there. He learned Thomas was heading south, moving erratically. He spread word among local reeves and bailiffs, a dangerous fugitive, likely wounded, to be apprehended on sight. He squeezed information from frightened peddlers and wary villagers. The name Oak Hollow eventually surfaced, a quiet village, a herbalist known for her skills. It was a long shot, but Caelan played every chance. One crisp morning, as Thomas was beginning to feel a fragile return of strength, his fever having finally broken, Alara returned from the village well, her face pale, her eyes wide with a new, more immediate fear. "Soldiers," she whispered, her voice trembling. "In the village, asking questions. A knight, tall, with a scar on his face. They are looking for a man. A wounded man." Thomas felt a cold dread grip him. Caelan, he had found him. He looked at Alara, at the terror in her eyes, and knew he had brought this danger to her doorstep. "You have to leave," she urged, grabbing his arm. "Now, through the woods, before they come here." He struggled to his feet, his side protesting, but the adrenaline of imminent capture overriding the pain. He grabbed the ledger. "Alara," he began, wanting to thank her, to apologize, but the words caught in his throat. "Go!" she hissed, pushing him towards the back door that led into the small, overgrown garden and the woods beyond. Just as he reached the edge of the trees, he heard the sound of horses approaching the cottage, the jingle of harness, the authoritative voice of Sir Caelan calling out Alara's name. He glanced back. Caelan and two of his men-at-arms were dismounting, their expressions grim. Thomas plunged into the woods, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was still weak, his escape a desperate, uncertain thing. He could hear faintly Caelan's voice questioning Alara. He prayed she would be safe, that her kindness wouldn't be her undoing. The climax was no grand battle, no heroic last stand. It was a grim, exhausting chase through the dense, unforgiving forest. Caelan, a skilled tracker and woodsman in his own right, was relentless. Thomas's weakness betrayed him. He stumbled, his vision blurring. He knew he couldn't outrun them for long. He found himself cornered in a small clearing, his back against a thick oak. Caelan and his two men emerged from the trees, swords drawn, their faces set. There was no escape. "Thomas Fletcher," Sir Caelan's voice was cold, devoid of emotion. "Your running ends here. For the murder of Master Alaric and for theft, you will answer to Lord Ashworth." Thomas leaned heavily against the oak, his breath ragged. He looked at Caelan, at the certainty in the knight's eyes. This was it, the end of the line. He thought of his father, of Alara, of the brief, illusory hope of peace, all gone. Then His eyes fell upon a young boy, no more than 7 or 8, who had evidently been gathering firewood and had stumbled upon the scene. The child stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, his eyes wide with terror, a small bundle of sticks clutched in his hands. He reminded Thomas so achingly of his younger brother, lost to the famine years ago. An idea, desperate and utterly reckless, sparked in Thomas's mind. Not for his own salvation, he knew that was impossible. But perhaps... "The ledger, Caelan," Thomas gasped, playing for time, his mind racing. "You want the ledger, don't you? Lord Ashworth will be very interested in what it contains. Names, his own, perhaps, among them." Caelan's eyes narrowed. "Give it to me, assassin. And if I don't?" Thomas taunted, his gaze flicking towards the terrified child. What if its contents become common knowledge? He took a half-step towards the boy, a purely theatrical move. It was enough. Caelan, ever the dutiful knight, reacted instinctively to the perceived threat to an innocent and to the more pressing threat of the ledger's exposure. "Seize him," he barked at his men. As the men-at-arms moved forward, Thomas did something unexpected. He didn't fight. He didn't try to flee. Instead, with a sudden, desperate burst of his remaining strength, he hurled the ledger not at Caelan, but deep into the densest part of the undergrowth, in the opposite direction of the child. "Fetch it!" Caelan roared, his attention momentarily diverted by the precious document. One of his men cursed and plunged into the thicket. In that brief moment of confusion, Thomas lunged, not at Caelan, but past him, shoving the remaining man-at-arms off balance and making a desperate stumbling run towards the terrified boy. He didn't try to grab the child. He just yelled, his voice raw. "Run, boy! Get away! Tell no one you saw anything!" The child, galvanized by the sudden chaos and the raw urgency in Thomas's voice, turned and fled, disappearing into the trees like a startled deer. It was Thomas's last act of defiance, his last conscious choice. Sir Caelan, recovering his composure, whirled, his sword a silver blur. Thomas felt a blinding pain in his shoulder as the steel bit deep. He stumbled, fell to his knees, the forest floor rushing up to meet him. He saw Caelan standing over him, the knight's face grim, unyielding. The other man-at-arms emerged from the undergrowth, triumphantly holding the mud-stained ledger. "Fool," Caelan said, his voice tight with contempt, perhaps for the unnecessary complication Thomas had caused. He raised his sword. Thomas Fletcher closed his eyes. He thought, strangely, of the scent of herbs in Alara's cottage, a clean, honest smell in a lifetime filled with filth and fear. It wasn't a bad final thought. Sir Caelan brought his sword down. Later, Caelan would report to Lord Ashworth that the assassin, Fletcher, had been slain resisting arrest, and the ledger recovered. No mention would be made of a terrified village boy, or a desperate, inexplicable act of misdirection. Thomas Fletcher's brief, brutal life, and his even briefer, unacknowledged sacrifice, would be swallowed by the indifferent silence of the forest, just another shadow erased from a world that had never truly wanted him. Alara, questioned by Caelan, but revealing little, would continue to heal the sick in Oak Hollow, sometimes wondering about the haunted man she had briefly sheltered, the man who had brought danger to her door, but had, in his own twisted way, tried to shield her from its worst consequences. The cycle of power, corruption, and desperate survival would grind on, indifferent to the fate of one forgotten assassin. The forest floor was cold beneath Thomas's cheek. The metallic taste of his own blood filled his mouth. Consciousness ebbed and flowed, a murky tide pulling him under. He heard Caelan's men cursing as they searched his meagre possessions, finding nothing of value beyond the worn dagger. The ledger, the source of so much trouble, was evidently the only prize they truly sought. He felt himself being roughly handled, dragged. The pain in his shoulder was a roaring fire, consuming what little strength he had left. Through a slit of one eye he saw the blurred canopy of trees, the indifferent grey sky. So this was it. Not a barrel, not a noose, but a forgotten death in a nameless patch of woods. At least it was quicker than the fever might have been. There was a grunt, and he was dropped unceremoniously to the ground. He could hear Caelan's low voice giving orders, something about a shallow grave. No point carrying a corpse back. Lord Ashworth only wanted the ledger and confirmation of the kill. Efficient. Brutal. The way of their world. A spade bit into the earth nearby. The rhythmic scraping sound was like a lullaby of finality. He wondered vaguely if the boy had gotten away safely. If Alara would be left in peace. Small, insignificant thoughts at the precipice of nothingness. He tried to summon the image of his father's face again, but it was fading, like an old tapestry worn thin by time and grief. Then a different sound, a twig snapping nearby, too close to be Kalen's men, a rustle in the undergrowth. Kalen's voice, sharp, alert. "Who goes there?" Silence, then a woman's voice, surprisingly steady, though laced with an undeniable tremor. "I am Alara, of Oak Hollow. I heard shouting. I came to see if anyone was hurt." Thomas's heart, which he thought had almost given up, gave a painful lurch. Alara, what was she doing here? Had Kalen sent for her, or had she followed them? Foolish woman. Dangerous, foolish woman. "This is no concern of yours, mistress." Kalen's tone was clipped, dismissive. "Return to your cottage. Is the man dead?" Alara's voice was softer now, barely audible. Thomas could imagine Kalen's impatient frown. "He will be shortly. A criminal, met his just end. Now, be gone." There was a pause. Then Alara spoke again, a desperate edge to her words. "Sir Knight, he was ill, fevered. Perhaps he was not in his right mind. He sought my aid. I am a healer." Thomas wanted to groan. What was she trying to achieve? Pity from a man like Kalen? Kalen, who saw the world in stark black and white, duty and dereliction? "His illness does not absolve him of murder, woman," Kalen said, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Do not meddle in matters that do not concern you. It will bring you only grief." Another pause. Then a soft thud, as if something had been dropped. "He carried this," Alara said. "When he first came to me, before all this, he dropped it. I found it after you took him." Thomas strained to hear. What was she talking about? He hadn't dropped anything at her cottage, except perhaps a few drops of his own wretched blood. "What is it?" Kalen's voice, suspicious. "I do not know, Sir Knight. Some kind of charm, perhaps, or a keepsake. It seemed important to him." Thomas felt a flicker of confusion through the fog of pain. A charm? A keepsake? He owned nothing of the sort. His only possession of any note was his dagger, and Kalen's men already had that. He heard the crunch of boots as Kalen presumably moved closer to whatever Alara had presented. A moment of silence. Then Kalen spoke, his voice different. Colder, if possible, but with a new, sharp interest. "Where did you say you found this?" "By the cot where he lay, Sir Knight. After he fled, it must have fallen from his tunic." Thomas's mind, sluggish and failing, tried to grasp what was happening. What could Alara possibly have found? What could she be showing Kalen that would alter that implacable knight's focus? He heard Kalen give a curt order to his men. "Hold a moment with that digging." Then Kalen's voice, directed at Alara, measured and intense. "This keepsake, woman. Describe it to me." Thomas could almost hear the tremor in Alara's voice as she replied. "It is small, Sir Knight, made of dark wood, carved, with a symbol, like a bird with its wings spread. A bird with spread wings. Dark wood." Thomas's breath hitched. It couldn't be. Years ago, when he was still a boy, before the enclosure, before the hunger, his mother had given him such a charm. A tiny, crudely carved wooden swift, a symbol of hope and safe journeys, whittled by his grandfather. He'd lost it during their eviction, a small, insignificant tragedy amidst the larger one. He hadn't thought of it in years. How could Alara? Unless she hadn't found it. Unless she had made it. Or had something like it. A desperate fabrication. But what end? To claim he was someone else? To confuse Kalen. "A swift," Kalen said, his voice flat. "Carved from bog oak." It wasn't a question. "Yes, Sir Knight," Alara affirmed. "Is it of significance?" A long silence. Thomas could feel the damp earth seeping into his clothes, the cold creeping into his bones. He was dying. This strange interlude was just a fever dream, a final bizarre trick of a failing mind. Then Kalen spoke again, his voice tight. "The man you tended, woman, did he speak of his past? Of a place called Ashworth Valley?" Ashworth Valley. That was where Lord Ashworth's main estate lay. Miles from Thomas's own birthplace. What was Kalen implying? "No, Sir Knight," Alara said. He spoke little. He was too ill. "But this charm," Kalen mused, almost to himself, "it is identical to one lost by my lord's younger son, years ago. Taken by bandits, it was presumed, along with the boy's pony during an ill-fated journey. The boy was never found, presumed dead." Thomas's mind reeled. Kalen's lord had a lost son, and Alara was trying to pass him off as this noble ghost? It was insane, utterly, terrifyingly insane. And yet, Kalen was listening. The digging had stopped. Perhaps Perhaps he is not the man you think, Sir Knight, Alara whispered, her voice filled with a desperate, manufactured hope. Perhaps he is lost, stolen, his mind affected by hardship. Kaelin was silent for a long moment. Thomas could hear the wind sighing in the trees, the distant caw of a crow. It felt like an eternity. He matches the age, Kaelin said slowly, and the build, what I recall from the descriptions of the boy, grown to manhood. But the eyes, this Fletcher's eyes are those of a killer, not a lost princeling. Hardship changes a man, Sir Knight, Alara pleaded, and fever can make a man seem wild. Another silence. Thomas felt a bizarre, detached curiosity. What would Kaelin do? Could this absurd, desperate ploy actually work? Could Alara's quick thinking, her incredible gamble, actually save his worthless life? And why was she doing it? For pity, or for some other reason he couldn't fathom? "Take off his tunic," Kaelin commanded his men. "Let me see his back." Rough hands tore at Thomas's blood-soaked garment. He was rolled onto his stomach, the movement sending fresh waves of agony through him. He heard Kaelin's sharp intake of breath. "There is a birthmark," Kaelin said, his voice strained, "shaped like a crescent moon, just below the left shoulder blade. The lost Ashworth boy had such a mark." Thomas's world tilted. A birthmark? He had no such thing, he was certain of it. This was no longer just Alara's desperate invention. This was something else, something impossible, unless Kaelin wanted to believe it, unless finding the lost son, even a brutalized, half-dead version of him, was somehow more advantageous to Kaelin or to Lord Ashworth than simply returning with a dead assassin and a compromising ledger. Unless finding the lost son, even a brutalized, half-dead version of him, was somehow more advantageous to Kaelin or to Lord Ashworth than simply returning with a dead assassin and a compromising politics. Power. Things Thomas had only ever brushed against from the bloody fringes. "It seems," Kaelin said, his voice carefully neutral, "that we may have made a grave error." He paused. "This man is not Thomas Fletcher, the assassin. This man may well be Alaric Ashworth, my lord's long-lost son." Thomas lay there, face down in the dirt, the cold earth a welcome relief from the fire in his body and the utter, bewildering chaos in his mind. He was, it seemed, no longer Thomas Fletcher, the doomed killer. He was, by some bizarre twist of fate, or by Alara's desperate gamble and Kaelin's sudden, inexplicable complicity, someone else entirely. Someone who might, just might, live. But as a different kind of darkness began to claim him, a question echoed in the fading remnants of his consciousness. If he was no longer Thomas Fletcher, then who, in God's name, was he? And what fresh hell awaited him in this new, stolen identity? The life of an assassin was grim, but at least it was his own. This new life, handed to him on a platter of lies and desperate hope, felt like a gilded cage, its bars already closing in. The world returned to Thomas in fragments. The jolting rhythm of a horse, the coarse scratch of a wool blanket against his skin, the distant muffled voices. Pain was a constant companion, a dull, throbbing ache in his shoulder and side, but the raging fire of the fever had subsided, leaving him weak and disoriented. He tried to open his eyes, but the lids were too heavy. He was lying on something soft, a litter, perhaps, slung between two horses. He could smell horse sweat, leather, and a faint, clean scent of herbs that he dimly associated with Alara. Had she come with them? Why? Memory trickled back, disjointed and surreal. Kaelin's words, "Alaric Ashworth, my lord's long-lost son." The absurdity of it was a lead weight in his gut. He, Thomas Fletcher, son of a dispossessed farmer, a common thief-turned-killer, was now supposedly a nobleman's heir. It was a farce, a dangerous, elaborate lie. But why would Kaelin, the stern, unyielding knight, perpetuate such a falsehood? The birthmark. Kaelin had claimed to see a birthmark. Thomas knew he had no such mark. Had Kaelin lied? Or had Alara somehow... No, that was impossible. This was Kaelin's game for reasons Thomas couldn't yet fathom. Perhaps Lord Ashworth's grief for a lost son was a weakness Kaelin could exploit. Or perhaps the ledger, now presumably in Kaelin's possession, contained information so damaging that creating a diversion, a miraculous return, was preferable to dealing with its fallout. He drifted. Snatches of conversation reached him. Kaelin's voice, crisp and authoritative. Another, rougher voice, one of his men-at-arms. And Alara's, soft and anxious, inquiring about his condition. So, she was with them. A healer, ostensibly tending to the miraculously recovered Alaric Ashworth. But Thomas knew her presence was more than that. She was the architect of this fragile illusion, the one who had inexplicably handed him this new, perilous identity. Days blurred into a haze of travel, pain, and uneasy sleep. Ilara tended to his wounds, her touch gentle, her face unreadable. He tried to speak to her once, when Kalen and his men were out of earshot, but his throat was too raw, his voice a mere croak. She simply placed a finger on his lips, her eyes conveying a warning that was impossible to misinterpret. Silence. Play along. He had no choice. He was too weak to flee, too powerless to protest. He was caught in a current far stronger than himself, swept along towards an unknown destination, an uncertain fate. The life of Thomas Fletcher, bleak as it had been, was over. The life of Alaric Ashworth, if it was to be a life at all, was just beginning, shrouded in lies and shadowed by the truth only he, Ilara, and perhaps Kalen, truly knew. They arrived at Ashworth Castle under a sky the colour of bruised plums. It was a formidable fortress, its grey stone walls rising sheer and imposing from the crest of a hill overlooking a fertile valley. Banners bearing the Ashworth falcon, a bird with spread wings, Thomas noted with a jolt, snapped in the wind. This was the seat of Lord Ashworth, the man Kalen served, the man whose son Thomas was now supposed to be. He was carried into the castle, no longer on a rough litter, but on a more comfortable pallet borne by castle servants. Whispers followed him like a rustling tide, the return of the lost heir, a miracle, a blessing from God. He caught glimpses of curious awestruck faces in the crowded bailey, of servants peering from doorways. The weight of their expectations, their hopes, was a suffocating blanket. He was taken to a large, well-appointed chamber, a far cry from the squalid inns and damp hovels he was accustomed to. A soft bed, tapestries on the walls depicting hunting scenes, a fire crackling merrily in a stone hearth. It was a world he had only ever dreamed of from the outside, a world he had no right to inhabit. Ilara was permitted to stay, ostensibly to continue his care. Kalen, after a brief, formal exchange with a stern-faced majordomo, disappeared, presumably to report to his lord. Thomas was left alone with Ilara, the silence in the room thick with unspoken questions. Why? He finally managed, his voice raspy but stronger than before. The single word was freighted with all his confusion, his fear, his unwilling gratitude. Ilara turned from the window, where she had been gazing out at the valley below. Her face was pale, her expression strained. He would have killed you, Thomas. I know that, he said. But this charade, why risk yourself? Why invent such a story? He still couldn't fathom the birthmark Kalen had claimed to see. Ilara sat on a stool near his bed. The charm, she said softly. The wooden swift, it was my brother's. He carved it before he was taken by the plague, years ago. I always kept it. When Sir Kalen's men were searching the village, asking about a man with a distinctive keepsake, I don't know why I did it. It was a desperate thought. I showed it to him. I said you had dropped it. Thomas stared at her. So the charm was real, but its connection to him was a lie she had spun on the spur of the moment. But the birthmark. Kalen, he began. He said he saw a birthmark, a crescent moon. Ilara looked away, her gaze troubled. I do not understand that part, Thomas. Sir Kalen, he seemed to want to believe it. After I showed him the charm, his demeanour changed. He asked me about Ashworth Valley, about the lost son. It was as if my Fule gave him an idea, an opportunity. That had to be it. Kalen was using him, using Ilara's desperate invention for his own purposes. And Lord Ashworth, perhaps grieving or politically vulnerable, was a willing participant in this deception. This is madness, Ilara, Thomas said, a sense of dread coiling in his stomach. I cannot play this part. I am no nobleman's son. I am... He trailed off. What was he now? You are alive, Thomas. Ilara said, her voice firm. For now. That is all that matters. You must play the part. Your life and perhaps mine depends on it. The door opened, and the majordomo entered, his expression impassive. Lord Ashworth will see his son now, he announced. Thomas felt a wave of nausea. He was about to meet the man whose real son he was impersonating, the man whose other associate, Master Alaric, he had murdered. The irony was a bitter pill. He exchanged a look with Ilara, a look of shared fear, of unwilling conspiracy. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Play along. Lord Ashworth was an older man, his frame stooped, his face etched with lines of grief and authority. He sat in a large carved chair by a massive fireplace, a fur robe clutched around his shoulders despite the warmth of the room. His eyes, when they fell on Thomas, were a startling mix of raw hope and deep, aching sorrow. Thomas was supported by 2 servants, his legs still unsteady. He felt like an imposter, a cheap actor in a play he didn't understand. "Alaric?" Lord Ashworth's voice was a hoarse whisper. "Is it truly you?" Thomas looked at this powerful, grieving man, this lord who held the power of life and death in his hands. He thought of his own father, broken and defeated. He thought of the lies that now bound him. He opened his mouth, unsure what would come out. "Father?" The word felt alien on his tongue, a betrayal of everything he had ever known. But it was the only word that might keep him alive. A single tear traced a path down Lord Ashworth's weathered cheek. He rose unsteadily, his gaze fixed on Thomas, searching, desperate. "My son," he breathed. "My son has come home." The lie had taken root. Thomas Fletcher was buried, and Alaric Ashworth, the prodigal son, had returned. But as he stood there, swaying on his feet, accepting the embrace of a stranger who called him son, Thomas knew that this new life, built on deceit and expediency, would be a far more dangerous and complex prison than any he had ever known. The shadows of his past and the truth of his identity would always be there, lurking, waiting to strike. And Sir Callan, the architect of this improbable salvation, would be watching, his motives still a mystery, his price yet to be named. The game had just begun, and Thomas was a pawn, albeit a surprisingly valuable one, on a board he couldn't fully see. The ensuing weeks were a blur of calculated performance and constant, gnawing anxiety. Thomas, now Alaric Ashworth, learned to navigate the opulent, treacherous currents of castle life. He feigned memory loss, a convenient consequence of his supposed years of hardship and the recent fever that had nearly claimed him. This explained his ignorance of past events, of familiar faces, of the intricate web of relationships that defined the Ashworth household. Lord Ashworth, clinging to the miracle of his son's return, was pathetically eager to fill in the blanks, to paint a picture of a cherished childhood that Thomas could only nod along to, his gut twisting with the duplicity of it all. He learned of his mother, long dead, of a sister, married off to a nobleman in a distant county, of childhood friends he couldn't recall, and tutors whose lessons were lost to him. Alara remained by his side, a constant, quiet presence, her role as healer giving her legitimate access to him. She coached him subtly, fed him snippets of information about the Ashworth family that she gleaned from castle gossip, her own fear a palpable undercurrent to her calm demeanour. They were co-conspirators in a play with stakes too high to contemplate. Sir Callan was a more enigmatic figure. He visited Thomas occasionally, his manner formal, his eyes watchful. He never spoke of the events in the forest, of the ledger, or of Thomas Fletcher. He treated Thomas with the deference due to his lord's son. Yet there was an unspoken understanding between them, a shared knowledge of the monumental lie they were perpetuating. Callan, Thomas realized, was the true puppet master here. He had orchestrated this, but to what end? Was it merely to protect Lord Ashworth from the scandal of the ledger? Or was there a deeper, more personal motive at play? The ledger itself was a silent, menacing ghost. Thomas knew Callan had it. He wondered if its contents were the true reason for his resurrection. By presenting a returned heir, had Callan somehow neutralized the threat the ledger posed to Lord Ashworth and his associates? Perhaps. But the knowledge that Callan possessed such a dangerous document, a document that could expose Thomas as a fraud and a murderer at any moment, was a constant source of dread. He learned to dress in fine clothes that felt alien against his skin, to eat rich foods that often sat uneasily in his stomach, to speak with a veneer of politeness that chafed against his raw, street-honed instincts. He was an actor, playing the most dangerous role of his life, and every day was a tightrope walk over a chasm of exposure. One evening Lord Ashworth, in a rare moment of lucidity and strength, summoned Thomas to his private study. The old lord looked frail, his eyes clouded with a familiar sorrow. "Alaric," he began, his voice thin, "there is something I must tell you about your disappearance." Thomas tensed. Was the lie about to unravel? "It was not bandits who took you," Lord Ashworth said, his gaze distant. "Not entirely. There were enemies, men who wished me ill. They saw you, my son, as a weakness, a way to wound me." He paused, his breath catching. I have always blamed myself. I was not careful enough. Thomas said nothing, merely listened, his mind racing. Was this another layer of the Ashworth family drama he was now enmeshed in? Caelan, Lord Ashworth continued. He was a young knight then, fiercely loyal. He swore to me he would find you or avenge you. He has never forgotten that vow. The old lord looked at Thomas, his eyes pleading. He believes you are a miracle, Alaric, as do I, but the world is a dangerous place. You must be cautious. Trust few. Trust few. The irony was not lost on Thomas. He was living a lie, surrounded by people whose true motives were hidden. As Thomas settled into his new, precarious identity, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was merely a pawn in a larger game, his fate dictated by the ambitions and fears of men like Lord Ashworth and Sir Caelan. The ghost of Thomas Fletcher, the assassin, was never far away, a constant reminder of the blood on his hands and the truth that could destroy him. His redemption, if it could be called that, was a fragile illusion, and the price for maintaining it, he suspected, was yet to be paid. The gilded cage of Ashworth Castle was proving to be a far more complex and dangerous prison than any he had ever known. He had escaped the hangman's noose, only to find himself ensnared in a web of noble intrigue, his life hanging by the thinnest of threads. The illusion held for several months, a fragile construct built on Lord Ashworth's desperate hope, Alara's quiet coaching, and Caelan's inscrutable agenda. Thomas, or rather Alaric, grew stronger physically. The rich food, the relative safety, and Alara's continued care mended his body, though his mind remained a battlefield of conflicting identities and gnawing anxieties. He learned to mimic the manners of a nobleman, to hold his tongue, to observe. He learned that courtly life was its own kind of wilderness, with predators just as dangerous as any cutthroat in a London alley. Only their weapons were whispers, alliances, and carefully veiled threats. Alara became his confidant by necessity. In hushed conversations, when they were certain they were alone, they pieced together what little they could. Caelan benefits somehow, Thomas rasped one night, staring into the fire. Lord Ashworth is old, his health failing. If I am the heir, Caelan, as the man who found me, who protected me, curries favour. Perhaps he aims to be regent, or the power behind a weak lord. Or perhaps, Alara suggested, her gaze troubled, the ledger contained something that threatened Caelan himself. By resurrecting you and controlling you, he controls the narrative. He buries the assassin Fletcher and any inconvenient truths along with him. That felt closer to the mark. Thomas knew the power of secrets. The ledger was a sword Caelan held over not just his head, but potentially over many others. His relationship with Lord Ashworth was a strange, painful dance. The old man doted on him, showering him with gifts, telling him stories of a childhood that wasn't his. Thomas felt a pang of something akin to pity for the grieving father, even as the guilt of his deception ate at him. He was a constant reminder of a son truly lost, a living embodiment of a lie. The first crack in the facade appeared in the form of Lady Isolde, Lord Ashworth's niece, a shrewd, observant woman with eyes as sharp as a hawk's. She arrived for a visit, her supposed cousin's miraculous return having reached her distant estate. Unlike the grief-stricken lord or the castle's eager-to-please retainers, Isolde was not so easily convinced. "You do not remember me at all, cousin Alaric?" she asked one evening, her voice silken but her gaze piercing, as they sat in the great hall. "We used to play by the river. You cheated at stones." Thomas, coached by Alara on the Ashworth family tree, managed a weak smile. "The fever, Lady Isolde, it took much. I am afraid many memories are clouded." "Indeed," Isolde murmured, her eyes lingering on his face, on the faded scar along his jawline, a memento from a tavern brawl, not a childhood scrape. A most convenient clouding. Her suspicion was a palpable thing, a cold draught in the warm hall. Thomas knew he had to be careful around her. She was not blinded by hope or complicit in the deceit. She was a threat. The true test came with the arrival of Sir Reginald Thorne, a neighbouring lord with whom the Ashworths had a long-standing, simmering feud over land rights. Thorne was a boorish, aggressive man, and he saw in the returned Alaric Ashworth not a miracle, but an opportunity. "So, the lost whelp has crawled back," Thorne boomed during a tense feast, his voice thick with wine and malice. "Still look as sickly as you did as a boy, Ashworth, or have the years in the gutter softened you entirely?" Thomas felt a familiar surge of cold anger, the instinct of the street fighter, the assassin. He wanted to silence this oaf permanently, but he was Alaric Ashworth now. He had to respond as a nobleman would. He forced a tight, dismissive smile. The gutter teaches resilience, Sir Reginald, something a soft life in a draughty keep might not impart. A gasp went around the table. Thorn's face purpled. Lord Ashworth looked alarmed. Even Caelan, standing impassively near his lord's chair, raised an eyebrow almost imperceptibly. "Resilience?" Thorn roared, slamming his tankard down. "I'll show you resilience." He lunged to his feet, his hand reaching for his sword hilt. Before anyone could react, Caelan moved. With a speed that belied his size, he stepped between Thomas and Thorn, his own hand resting lightly on his pommel. "Sir Reginald," Caelan's voice was calm, but with an underlying edge of steel. "You forget yourself. You are a guest in Lord Ashworth's hall, and this is his son. Any quarrel you have will be settled by the proper channels, not by brawling like a common foot soldier." Thorn, faced with Caelan's implacable presence and the silent condemnation of the other guests, slowly subsided, muttering curses. The moment passed, but the tension lingered. Later Caelan sought Thomas out. "That was unwise, my Lord Alaric," he said, his tone neutral. "He provoked me," Thomas replied, still smarting from the public insult and from the restraint he'd been forced to show. "Provocation is a weapon," Caelan said, "one you nearly turned upon yourself. A nobleman settles disputes with words, with alliances, or, if necessary, with a formal challenge, not with tavern brawls." He paused, his gaze intense. "You are Alaric Ashworth. Remember that. Thomas Fletcher is dead. He must remain so." The warning was clear. Caelan was invested in this charade, and he would not tolerate anything that threatened it. But the incident with Thorn had an unintended consequence. It showed Thomas that he still possessed a core of the man he once was, the survivor, and it showed him that Caelan, for all his inscrutability, was actively protecting the illusion, and by extension, Thomas himself. The question remained, why? The answer, or part of it, began to crystallize when Lord Ashworth's health took a sharp decline. The old man became bedridden, his mind wandering. The running of the estate, the command of its men, fell increasingly to Caelan, with Alaric as the figurehead heir, still too frail or inexperienced to take full control. Caelan was consolidating his power, using Thomas as his legitimate front. Alara saw it too. "He means to rule through you, Thomas," she whispered one night, her face etched with worry. When Lord Ashworth passes, you will be lord in name, but Caelan will hold the reins." "And if I refuse to be his puppet?" Thomas asked, the thought a bitter one. Alara's eyes were filled with fear. Then Thomas Fletcher might find himself resurrected just long enough to be executed for the murder of Master Alaric of Oakhaven, and the ledger. Sir Caelan still has the ledger. The trap was perfectly laid. Thomas was caught between his false identity and his true, murderous past. He was a lord with no power, a survivor with no escape. Lady Isolde, however, was not idle. Her suspicions about Alaric had only deepened. She began to make discreet inquiries, to probe the inconsistencies in his story, to observe his interactions with Caelan and Alara. She was like a patient hunter, slowly tightening a net. One day she confronted Alara directly. "This man you healed, Mistress Alara," Isolde said, her voice deceptively mild. "His recovery was remarkable, almost too remarkable, and his memories so selective. Tell me, did he speak of any old wounds? Ones that a true son of Ashworth, lost for so long, might have acquired in a harsh world." Alara, though frightened, held her ground. "He was gravely ill, my lady. My concern was his survival, not his history." Isolde smiled, a thin, knowing smile. "Of course, but history has a way of revealing itself, does it not?" Thomas knew that time was running out. Lady Isolde was a genuine threat, one Caelan might not be able to control or dismiss, and Lord Ashworth was fading. Soon, the question of succession would become immediate, and Thomas's ability to play the part of Alaric Ashworth would be tested as never before. The gilded cage was shrinking, its bars pressing ever closer. He had to find a way out, a way to reclaim some measure of control before Caelan's plans, or Isolde's suspicions, or his own hidden past, finally consumed him. The only question was, how? He had no allies, no resources, only the wits of a survivor and the desperate courage of a man with nothing left to lose. Again. The opportunity, when it came, was wrapped in violence and betrayal, familiar companions from Thomas's former life. Sir Reginald Thorne, still smarting from his public humiliation and egged on by whispers of Lord Ashworth's failing health and the weakness of his supposed heir, decided to press his territorial claims more forcefully. Raiders bearing Thorne's Boer insignia began to harry Ashworth's outlying tenants, burning crops and stealing livestock. It was a direct challenge, one Caelan could not ignore if he wished to maintain his grip on the estate and the loyalty of its people. A retaliatory force had to be assembled, and Alaric Ashworth, the heir, would be expected to ride with it, or be branded a coward. "You will ride at my side, my Lord Alaric," Caelan stated, more command than suggestion. "It is time you showed the men and our enemies that the Ashworth falcon still has talons." Thomas felt a knot of cold dread. He was no warrior, no knight. His skills lay in stealth and swift, brutal dispatch, not in organized combat or leading men. But he saw the glint in Caelan's eye. This was another test. Refusal was not an option. Alara was pale with fear when he told her. "This is too dangerous, Thomas. You are not trained for this." "Caelan leaves me no choice," Thomas said grimly. "And perhaps there is an opportunity in this. Away from the castle, away from Isolde's watchful eyes. An opportunity for what? He didn't yet know. Escape, or something more? The Ashworth men, a mix of seasoned men-at-arms and hastily levied tenants, rode out under Caelan's command. Alaric, a conspicuous, uncomfortable figure amongst them in borrowed armour that felt heavy and ill-fitting. He kept his visor down as much as possible, hiding the unease he knew must be etched on his face. They tracked Thorne's raiders to a wooded valley near the disputed border. Caelan, a skilled commander, laid his plans for an ambush. Thomas listened, a silent observer, his old instincts assessing the terrain, the wind, the likely points of attack and retreat. He saw flaws in Caelan's otherwise sound plan, small vulnerabilities a desperate man might exploit. The ensuing skirmish was a chaotic, brutal affair. Steel rang against steel, men shouted and screamed, horses whinnied in terror. Thomas found himself in the thick of it, his borrowed sword feeling clumsy in his hand. He fought with the desperation of a cornered animal, his movements lacking finesse but driven by a raw survival instinct. He saw men fall, Ashworth men and Thorne's men alike, the ground quickly turning slick with mud and blood. It was during a moment of intense fighting, when Caelan was engaged with Thorne himself in a furious sword fight, that Thomas saw his chance. Or rather, a chance was presented to him. One of Caelan's own men, a burly sergeant named Rolf, whom Thomas had always vaguely distrusted, was positioned behind Caelan. As Caelan parried a savage blow from Thorne, Rolf, instead of defending his commander's exposed back, subtly shifted his shield, leaving a momentary opening. And in that instant, one of Thorne's men, seizing the opportunity, lunged with a spear. Thomas reacted without thinking. He wasn't Alaric Ashworth, noble heir. He wasn't even Thomas Fletcher, calculating assassin. He was just a man seeing a betrayal, a life about to be unfairly extinguished. He threw himself forward, his own sword coming up in a clumsy but desperate parry, deflecting the spear thrust aimed at Caelan's back. The spearhead scored a deep gash along Thomas's arm, sending a jolt of agony through him, but Caelan was unharmed. Caelan, his duel with Thorne momentarily forgotten, whirled, his eyes taking in the scene. Thomas bleeding, the thwarted spearman, and Rolf, whose expression was a fleeting mask of shock and guilt before it hardened into something unreadable. Caelan dispatched Thorne with a swift, brutal efficiency, then turned his attention to Rolf. "Sergeant," Caelan's voice was deadly quiet. "Explain yourself." Rolf blustered, claiming he hadn't seen the threat, but his eyes darted nervously. It was clear, at least to Thomas, that Rolf had intended for Caelan to fall. Why? Was Rolf in Thorne's pay? Or was this part of some deeper intrigue within Ashworth's own ranks? The skirmish ended soon after, Thorne's remaining men fleeing or surrendering. Caelan, his face a grim mask, ordered Rolf bound and taken back to Ashworth Castle for questioning. He then turned to Thomas, his gaze uncharacteristically direct. "You saved my life, my Lord Alaric," Caelan said, his voice devoid of its usual neutrality. There was something akin to surprise, perhaps even grudging respect in his eyes. Thomas, clutching his bleeding arm, merely nodded, the pain making him feel light-headed. He was open, he managed. Later, as Alara, who had accompanied the force as a healer, tended to his new wound, Caelan approached them. The night dismissed the guards, leaving the three of them alone in the flickering torchlight of the campaign tent. "Rolf has confessed," Calen said, his voice low. "He was in the pay of Lady Isolde." Thomas and Ilara exchanged shocked glances. "Isolde? Why would she want Calen dead?" "She saw me as an obstacle," Calen continued, his eyes fixed on Thomas. "With Lord Ashworth failing and you as the malleable heir, she believed that if I were removed, she could manipulate you, perhaps even contest your claim, secure the Ashworth lands for her own line." He paused. "She underestimated you, it seems, and she certainly underestimated Rolf's incompetence." "So, she tried to have you killed," Thomas said, the pieces falling into place. "Isolde wasn't just suspicious, she was actively plotting. And you, Thomas Fletcher," Calen said, the name a quiet shock in the small tent, "saved me. Why?" Thomas met Calen's gaze. The pretense was gone, at least for this moment. "I don't know," he said honestly. "It was an instinct. No man deserves a blade in the back, not even you." A long silence hung between them. Ilara watched them both, her expression anxious. "The ledger," Calen said finally. "It implicated Lord Ashworth, yes, but it also contained details of certain indiscretions of Lady Isolde's late husband, and of Sir Reginald Thorne's dealings with French agents during the war, enough to ruin them both, or see them hanged for treason." Thomas understood. The ledger was Calen's shield and his sword. By keeping its contents secret, by controlling who knew what, he maintained a precarious balance of power. His resurrection of Thomas as Alaric Ashworth had been a desperate, brilliant gambit to stabilize a situation that threatened to explode. "Isolde will not stop," Calen stated. "She is too ambitious, too ruthless, and now she knows you are not the easily manipulated fool she hoped for. She will try again, against me or against you." "What do you propose?" Thomas asked, a strange sense of calm settling over him. The lines were drawn. The enemies and the unlikely allies were becoming clearer. Calen looked at Thomas, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "Lord Ashworth is dying. Soon you will be Lord Ashworth in truth, at least in name. But a lord needs to be strong, decisive. He needs to eliminate threats." He paused. "Lady Isolde is a threat. Sir Reginald Thorne, though defeated, will remain a festering wound." The implication was clear. Calen was offering him a path, not just to survival, but to power. A bloody, treacherous path, but a path nonetheless. He was offering Thomas Fletcher, the assassin, a chance to use his deadly skills, not for a handful of coins, but for the security of his new, false life, and perhaps for a semblance of control over his own destiny. "You want me to remove them?" Thomas asked, the words tasting familiar, yet strangely different in this new context. "I want Lord Alaric Ashworth to secure his lands and his position," Calen corrected him, his voice once again coolly neutral. "How he chooses to do that is a matter for his own judgment, but he will have my counsel and my support." He held Thomas's gaze. "You saved my life. A debt is owed, and I believe Thomas Fletcher may have more use than I initially anticipated." The game had shifted. Thomas was no longer just a pawn. He was, potentially, a player, a dangerous player, with a Knight Commander as his unlikely and equally dangerous ally. The price for his continued existence, it seemed, was to become the very thing he was pretending to be, a ruthless lord, willing to do whatever it took to survive and to hold on to power. The irony was almost too much to bear, but as he looked at Calen, he saw not a saviour, but a fellow survivor, a man who understood the brutal necessities of their world, and in that shared understanding, a new, perilous chapter of his life began. The cage was still there, but perhaps, just perhaps, he was learning how to rattle its bars. Lord Ashworth lingered for another moon, a flickering candle in the great stone keep. Thomas, now more Alaric than he ever thought possible, sat by his supposed father's bedside, listening to rambling memories, offering what comfort he could. It was a strange penance. The guilt of his deception warred with a surprising, reluctant tenderness for the dying who saw in him a beloved son. Ilara, ever present, provided not just medical care but a quiet, grounding force for them both. Lady Isolde, meanwhile, had returned to her own estates, her plot against Calen thwarted, but her ambition undiminished. She sent messages of condolence, of feigned concern for her uncle, but Thomas and Calen knew she was biding her time, regrouping. Thorne, licking his wounds, was a lesser threat for now, but one that could not be ignored indefinitely. The day Lord Ashworth died, a heavy silence fell over the castle. Thomas stood by the window of his chamber, looking out at the lands that were now, in name, his. Lord Alaric Ashworth. It felt like a costume he couldn't take off. Caelan entered without knocking. "The arrangements are made," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "The funeral will be in 3 days. Lords from neighbouring estates will attend. Lady Isolde will be here." "And then?" Thomas asked, turning to face the knight. "And then, Lord Ashworth," Caelan said, a faint emphasis on the title, "you will secure your legacy." The funeral was a grand, sombre affair. Thomas played his part, the grieving son, accepting condolences, his face a mask of dignified sorrow. Alara stood discreetly in the background, her presence a silent reassurance. Lady Isolde watched him throughout the ceremony, her eyes like chips of ice. He could feel her probing for weakness, for any crack in his facade. After the interment, in the great hall now draped in mourning black, the lords gathered. It was here, Caelan had counselled, that Alaric Ashworth must make his first true assertion of power. Lady Isolde, true to form, was the first to speak, her voice carrying clearly across the hushed room. "A tragic loss. My uncle was a great man." She turned to Thomas. "And now, young Alaric, the burden of his legacy falls upon your shoulders. A heavy burden indeed, for one so recently returned to us, and so inexperienced in the ways of lordship." Her tone was sympathetic, but the barb was unmistakable. Before Thomas could reply, another lord, an ally of Isolde's, chimed in. Indeed, perhaps a council of guidance would be beneficial, until Lord Alaric finds his footing. This was it, the challenge. Thomas felt a cold knot in his stomach, but also a strange burgeoning resolve. He was tired of being a pawn, tired of the fear. He looked at Caelan, who stood near the hearth, his expression unreadable, yet expectant. He thought of Alara, of the risk she had taken for him. He thought of the brutal life he had led as Thomas Fletcher, a life of shadows and desperation. He would not return to that. He drew himself up, meeting Isolde's gaze directly. "I thank you for your concern, Lady Isolde, and yours, Lord Bryn. My father's wisdom will be sorely missed. And yes, I have been absent for many years, but I am no stranger to hardship, and I am no stranger to the responsibilities that now fall to me." He paused, letting his words sink in. "As for guidance," he continued, his voice firmer now, resonating with an authority that surprised even himself, "I have Sir Caelan, my father's most trusted commander, a man whose loyalty and wisdom are beyond question. His counsel will be invaluable." He saw Caelan give a curt, almost imperceptible nod. "And as for my experience," Thomas's eyes swept the room, "I learn quickly, and I will not tolerate any who seek to undermine the stability of Ashworth lands, or who mistake grief for weakness." His gaze settled on Isolde, then on Thorn, who sat glowering in a corner. "The enemies of Ashworth will find that the falcon's talons are as sharp as ever." A stunned silence followed his words. He had not shouted, not threatened overtly, but the message was clear. Alaric Ashworth, the returned heir, was not the pliant boy they had expected. Lady Isolde's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing more for now. The other lords shifted uncomfortably. Caelan, Thomas noted, allowed a ghost of a smile to touch his lips. In the weeks that followed, Thomas, with Caelan as his right hand and Alara as his quiet, indispensable adviser on the needs of the common folk, a perspective often overlooked by nobility, began to truly inhabit his role. He learned about estate management, about local grievances, about the intricate dance of alliances and rivalries. He made mistakes, but he learned from them. He found he had a knack for seeing through deceptions, a skill honed in a lifetime of navigating treacherous alleys and untrustworthy clients. The matter of Lady Isolde and Sir Reginald Thorn remained. Caelan was patient, but his expectation was clear. Threats must be neutralized. Thomas didn't want more blood on his hands, not if it could be avoided. He was tired of killing. But he also knew that weakness in their world was an invitation to destruction. He chose a different path first. Using the information from Alaric's ledger, which Caelan discreetly provided selected portions of, Thomas, through carefully chosen intermediaries, began to apply pressure. He let it be known that he possessed certain documents that could prove embarrassing, even ruinous to Thorn, linking him to smuggling and questionable wartime dealings. Thorn, a bully but not a fool, understood the veiled threat. His raiding parties ceased. He became uncharacteristically quiet. Lady Isolde was a more difficult adversary. The ledger held less on her directly, though it implicated her late husband deeply, a scandal that could still tarnish her name and her ambitions for her own son. Thomas, again through intermediaries, proposed a truce. An understanding. Ashworth lands would remain Ashworth lands. Her own holdings would be respected. But any further attempts to destabilize his rule would be met with the full revelation of her late husband's indiscretions. It was a gamble. Isolde was proud. But she was also pragmatic. She sent no reply, but her covert plotting seemed to cease. For now, an uneasy peace settled. Thomas knew it was temporary. Such truces were fragile, but he had bought himself time. Time to learn, time to consolidate his position, time to become the lord he was pretending to be. One evening, Elara found him staring out at the moonlit valley from the battlements. "You are different, Thomas," she said softly, using his old name, as she sometimes did when they were truly alone. He looked at her, a faint smile on his lips. "Am I? Or am I just a better actor?" "No," she said. "You are Lord Ashworth now, in more than just name. You carry the weight of it, and you carry it surprisingly well. With your help," he said, "and Kaelin's." He still didn't fully trust the knight, but their alliance, born of mutual necessity, had proven effective. "Kaelin serves his own ends always," Elara cautioned. "Do not forget that." "I haven't," Thomas said, "but for now our ends align." He looked out at the sleeping lands. "It's a strange life, Elara. I spend my days trying to protect the legacy of a man whose son I am not, whose associate I murdered." "You protect the people of these lands now, Thomas," Elara said. "Whatever your name, whatever your past, that is a worthy endeavour." He knew she was right. He had been given a chance, a bizarre, undeserved chance, to be more than a shadow, more than a killer. The cost was a constant vigilance, a life built on a lie. But as he looked out at the peaceful valley, he felt, for the first time in a long, long time, a flicker of something that might almost be hope. Or perhaps just the grim determination of a survivor who had found a new, more complex battle to fight. The ledger remained with Kaelin, a silent guarantee of Thomas's continued cooperation and Kaelin's own security. The ghost of Thomas Fletcher, the assassin, was not entirely banished. He was a part of Lord Alaric Ashworth, a shadowed core of ruthlessness and survival instinct that this new life often demanded. Years passed. Lord Alaric Ashworth, with Sir Kaelin as his formidable marshal and Elara as his quiet conscience and healer of his people, ruled Ashworth lands with a surprisingly steady hand. He was known as a stern but fair lord, a man who understood hardship, a man who did not suffer fools or traitors gladly. Lady Isolde remained a watchful, distant rival, their truce holding by a thread of mutual self-interest. Sir Reginald Thorne kept to his own lands, cowed but resentful. Thomas never forgot who he truly was, or the blood on his hands. The lie was his constant companion, the price of his survival, the foundation of his borrowed life. He never sought out another woman, never risked a marriage that would further entangle him in deceit. Elara remained his closest, perhaps his only, true confidant, their bond forged in shared danger and unspoken truths. Sometimes, late at night, when the castle was quiet, he would walk the battlements, the wind whipping his cloak around him, and look out at the dark, sleeping land. He was an impostor, a murderer, a lord by default and deception. But he was also a protector, a ruler, a man who had, against all odds, found a precarious kind of peace. The irony was never lost on him. Thomas Fletcher might be dead, but Alaric Ashworth, the ghost in the machine, lived on. His story, a testament to the brutal, unpredictable, and often absurd twists of fate, in a world that chewed men up and spat them out in forms they could never have imagined. His secret remained safe, buried deep beneath the weight of a stolen name and a hard-won lordship, a silent, ticking clock in the heart of Ashworth Castle. One harsh winter, a sickness swept through the lower town, a fever that burned hot and fast, reminiscent of the plagues that haunted older memories. Elara worked tirelessly, her knowledge of herbs and healing pushed to its limits. Thomas, as Lord Ashworth, did what he could, ordering provisions distributed, ensuring pyres were kept burning to dispose of the dead, and he hoped to cleanse the air. He walked among the sick himself, against Kaelin's stern advice, a grim echo of a past where he had moved through squalor as a native. It was during this bleak time that Kaelin sought him out, his face unusually grave. They stood in the castle's draughty scriptorium, maps of the estate spread across a large table. "My lord," Calen began, his voice low, "there is a matter I must bring to your attention. One I have delayed." Thomas looked up from a list of depleted grain stores. "What is it, Calen? More trouble from Thorn? Or has Isolde finally decided to break our understanding?" "Neither," Calen said. He hesitated, a rare sign of unease from the night. "It concerns the ledger, the original ledger of Master Alaric of Oakhaven." Thomas felt a familiar chill. The ledger, the foundation of Calen's power over him, the damning evidence of his past. "What of it?" "Its contents, as you know, implicated many," Calen said, "including your predecessor, Lord Ashworth, and, to a lesser degree, myself, through association and perhaps a certain willful ignorance of some of his dealings." He met Thomas's gaze. "I have kept it safe. Its existence has been a useful deterrent." "I am aware of its utility," Thomas said dryly. "But such a document," Calen continued, "is also a lingering poison. While it exists, the truth of Thomas Fletcher and the full extent of the corruption it detailed could always surface. A careless word, a desperate man seeking leverage, it could unravel everything we have built." Thomas waited. Calen was not a man for idle conversation. "Lord Ashworth is gone," Calen said. "Many named in that ledger are also dead, either from time or plague or their own misadventures. Its power to coerce has diminished. Its power to destroy, however, remains absolute should it fall into the wrong hands." He paused. "Specifically into the hands of someone who might wish to see you undone, my lord, and by extension discredit me and destabilize these lands." "You mean Isolde?" Thomas stated. Calen nodded. "She is patient. She has not forgotten. If she ever suspected the true depth of the deception surrounding your identity, that ledger would be her ultimate weapon." "So what are you proposing, Calen?" Thomas asked, a sense of unease prickling his skin. "That we destroy it? After all these years, you are willing to burn your most potent insurance?" Calen walked to the hearth, where a low fire smouldered. He stared into the flames for a long moment. "I am proposing, my lord," he said, turning back, "that you destroy it." Thomas was taken aback. "Me? Why?" "Because," Calen said, his expression unreadable, "for years it has been the chain that bound you, however gilded your cage. It has been the unspoken threat that ensured your cooperation. But you are no longer the desperate fugitive I dragged from that forest. You are Lord Ashworth. You have ruled these lands through plague and petty war with a firmness I did not anticipate." He almost smiled. Perhaps it is time the true Lord Ashworth decided the fate of his own past. He produced the leather-bound ledger from within his tunic. It looked innocuous, just an old book, yet Thomas knew it held the power to obliterate his life. Calen placed it on the table between them. "The choice is yours, my lord," Calen said. "Burn it and Thomas Fletcher truly dies, his secrets turn to ash. Keep it and you retain a weapon, but also a constant vulnerability. What is your decision?" Thomas stared at the ledger. He thought of the fear it had instilled in him for so long. He thought of the power Calen had wielded through it, and he thought of the life he had built, however false its foundations. He reached out and took the ledger. Its leather cover was worn, the pages brittle. He could feel the weight of its secrets, the lives it had touched and ruined. He walked to the hearth, Calen watching him, silent and unmoving. For a moment he hesitated. To destroy it was to place an enormous amount of trust in Calen, to remove the knight's most obvious hold over him, but it was also to liberate himself in a way he hadn't thought possible, to truly bury Thomas Fletcher and commit to being Alaric Ashworth, for better or worse. With a sudden, decisive movement, he tossed the ledger into the heart of the fire. The flames licked at its edges, then caught, consuming the dry parchment with a hungry roar. Names, figures, secrets, all turning to smoke and ash. The scent of burning leather and paper filled the small room. Thomas watched until the last page had curled and blackened, until nothing remained but glowing embers. He felt lighter, not free, not entirely. The truth of his past was branded on his soul, but a significant weight had been lifted. He turned to Calen. "It is done." Calen nodded slowly. "Indeed, my lord, it is done." A new understanding passed between them, unspoken but profound. The dynamic had shifted. Calen had, in his own way, acknowledged Thomas's transformation, his legitimacy as Lord Ashworth, by entrusting him with the destruction of their shared dangerous secret. It was a gamble for Calen too, relinquishing such a powerful tool. "Why now, Calen?" Thomas asked, the question that had been burning in his mind. After all this time? Caelan looked out the window at the snow-covered lands of Ashworth. Perhaps, my lord, he said, his voice softer than Thomas had ever heard it. Because I, too, am tired of living with ghosts. Thomas Fletcher was a necessary phantom for a time, but Ashworth needs a true lord, not a haunted one. And I serve Ashworth. He paused. And perhaps I owed you a debt for that day in the valley, a life for a life, or at least a secret for a life. He bowed, a formal gesture, yet imbued with a new subtle respect. I will leave you, my lord. Caelan departed, leaving Thomas alone with the dying fire and the faint smell of burnt secrets. He knew their alliance was still one of convenience, of necessity, but something had irrevocably changed. The chain was broken. In the years that followed, Lord Alaric Ashworth ruled with growing confidence. The memory of Thomas Fletcher did not fade entirely, but it became a scar, a reminder of a past survived, rather than an open wound. He never learned if Caelan had lied about the crescent moon birthmark, or if it had been a convenient delusion the knight had seized upon in a moment of desperate opportunism. It no longer mattered. The lie had become his truth. Alara remained his friend, his conscience. She never married, dedicating her life to her healing, a quiet, steadfast presence in his often turbulent world. Theirs was a bond deeper than lordship or secrets, a friendship forged in the crucible of shared danger and an unspoken understanding of the man he truly was, and the man he had become. Lady Isolde, her ambitions checked but never extinguished, remained a distant, watchful presence. But with the ledger gone and Thomas's hold on his lordship solidified, her power to threaten him diminished. She became just another piece on the complex board of feudal politics. Thomas Fletcher, the assassin from the gutters of London, was gone, consumed by the flames along with Master Alaric's ledger. In his place stood Lord Alaric Ashworth, a ruler shaped by a brutal past and an improbable present. He was not a good man, perhaps, not in the way the priests spoke of goodness, but he was a survivor. And in the harsh, unforgiving world of 14th century England, that was often more than enough. He carried his secrets and his stolen name to his grave, a complex, contradictory figure who had, against all odds, carved out a life from the ashes of another. And no one, save perhaps an aging herbalist and a stoic knight commander, ever truly knew the full, astonishing story of the falcon who had once been a common swift, flying in the darkest of shadows. The final years of Lord Alaric Ashworth's rule were marked by a hard-won stability. The lands prospered, not through any inherent brilliance on his part, but through a grim pragmatism and an understanding of human nature honed in the harshest of schools. He knew when to be firm, when to be lenient, and most importantly, when to listen to the counsel of those he trusted. A very small circle consisting mainly of Caelan and Alara. Caelan remained his steadfast marshal, his loyalty to Ashworth. Whether the man or the legacy, Thomas was never entirely sure, unwavering. Their relationship evolved into one of mutual, guarded respect. The knight never spoke of Thomas Fletcher again, and Thomas never pressed him on the true origins of the crescent moon birthmark story. Some truths were best left buried with the ashes of the ledger. Caelan was a man who valued order and strength above all, and in Thomas he had found, or perhaps moulded, a lord who could provide both. Alara became a revered figure in her own right, her healing skills and quiet wisdom sought by many. She was Thomas's anchor to a simpler, more honest world, a constant reminder that even amidst the deceit and power plays, basic human decency had a place. Their friendship was the one untainted thing in his life, a quiet solace. He ensured her cottage was always supplied, her work unhindered, a small repayment for the life she had, in essence, gifted him. As he aged, the lines on Thomas's face deepened, not with the arrogance of nobility, but with the wariness of a man who had lived many lives in one. The ghost of Thomas Fletcher never entirely vanished. It was there in the watchfulness of his eyes, in the way he still preferred the shadows, in the rare, chilling moments when a situation demanded a ruthlessness that shocked even Caelan. But Alaric Ashworth was the role he had played for so long that it had become his skin. He never married, never risked an heir who might unravel the carefully constructed tapestry of his life. Lady Isolde, growing old herself, eventually ceased to be a significant threat, her ambitions turning to her own grandchildren. The world moved on, New conflicts arose, new alliances were forged, but Ashworth lands remained secure, a testament to a strange and unlikely stewardship. One cold autumn evening, as Thomas sat by the fire in his study, an old man now, his body aching with the memory of old wounds, Caelan entered. The night, too, was grey, his movements stiffer, but his eyes still held that familiar, piercing intensity. "My lord," Caelan said, his voice rougher with age, "there is a visitor, a young man. He claims a connection to Oakhaven, to a wool merchant named Alaric." Thomas felt a jolt, a cold echo from a lifetime ago. Oakhaven, Master Alaric, the name he had stolen, now worn like a shroud. "And what does this young man want?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "He says he is the grandson of a man who served Master Alaric," Caelan replied, watching Thomas closely. "He carries an old story, a tale of a stolen ledger, a murdered master, and an assassin who vanished. He seeks justice, perhaps, or just answers." Thomas looked into the fire, the flames dancing, consuming the wood, just as they had consumed the ledger all those years ago. The past, it seemed, was never truly buried. "And what do you advise, Caelan?" Thomas asked, a faint, weary smile touching his lips. Caelan was silent for a moment. "The world is full of stories, my lord," he said finally, "some true, some false. This young man's tale, it is old, faded. The men involved are mostly dust. Thomas Fletcher, the assassin he speaks of, died many years ago in a forest, a common outlaw. That is the official record. That is the truth we have lived by." "Indeed," Thomas murmured, "the truth they had manufactured. However," Caelan continued, "if this young man were to persist, were to stir up old ghosts, it could be unsettling for the peace of these lands." Thomas understood. Even now, after all these years, the foundation of his life was fragile. A determined inquiry, a whisper in the right ear, could still bring it all crashing down. "What do you propose we do with him, this teller of old tales?" Thomas asked. Caelan met his gaze. "He is young, my lord, perhaps misguided. Perhaps a small sum of silver for his troubles, and a strong suggestion that some stories are best left untold, would be sufficient to see him on his way, to seek his fortune elsewhere. A payoff for silencing the old ways. Thomas Fletcher would have understood. Lord Alaric Ashworth, it seemed, still did. "See to it, Caelan," Thomas said, his voice tired. "Be discreet, and generous enough that he does not feel the need to share his story further." Caelan nodded. "As you command, my lord." He turned to leave. "Caelan," Thomas called after him. The knight paused at the door. Was any of it true?" Thomas asked, the question he had held unspoken for decades. "The birthmark? The lost son?" Caelan stood silhouetted against the light from the corridor. He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Lord Ashworth lost a son, my lord, a tragedy from which he never truly recovered. As for the rest—" He shrugged, a gesture that could have meant anything or nothing. "Faith, my lord, is a powerful thing. Sometimes it can even conjure miracles from the most unlikely clay." He bowed and was gone. Thomas Fletcher, known to the world as Lord Alaric Ashworth, was left alone with the fire and his thoughts. Miracles from unlikely clay. Perhaps that was what he was. A fiction that had, through time and necessity, become a kind of truth. He had survived. He had even, in his own flawed, compromised way, ruled. It was more than Thomas Fletcher could ever have dreamed of, and a heavier burden than Alaric Ashworth was ever meant to bear. He died peacefully in his bed a few years later, the last of his line, as he had no true heir to succeed him directly. The Ashworth lands passed to a distant cousin, one of Lady Isolde's more sensible grandsons, who had learned the value of Caelan's counsel. Alara outlived him by several years, a respected elder in Oak Hollow, her cottage still smelling of herbs and quiet wisdom. She never spoke of the secret she carried, the truth of the haunted man she had saved and befriended. Sir Caelan served the new Lord Ashworth with the same unwavering loyalty he had shown the old, a pillar of strength and order until his own death. He took the full story of Thomas Fletcher and the miraculous return of Alaric Ashworth to his grave, a final, unyielding act of service to the legacy he had helped create. And so the tale of Thomas Fletcher, the assassin who became a lord, faded into the mists of time, becoming just another whispered legend, another half-forgotten story in the long, bloody and improbable history of the land. The truth, like the ashes of a burnt ledger, scattered to the winds, leaving behind only the enduring mystery of a life lived on the razor's edge between shadow and nobility, deceit, and a strange, hard-won dignity. The young man from Oak Haven, his pockets heavier with Ashworth silver, and his mind filled with Caelan's stern, though not unkind, counsel about the dangers of stirring old embers, did indeed depart. He took his grandfather's fragmented story with him, perhaps to embellish it in taverns far from Ashworth lands, or perhaps to let it fade entirely, a confusing and unprofitable piece of family lore. The immediate threat, Thomas knew, was neutralized, but the encounter served as a stark reminder. The past was a tenacious ghost, never truly exorcised, only temporarily placated. This incident, however, seemed to settle something in Thomas. The fear of exposure, which had been his constant companion for decades, lessened, replaced by a weary acceptance. He had played his role to the end of the act. The audience was either convinced or had chosen to believe the performance. What came after was beyond his control. His final years were quiet. He delegated more of the day-to-day running of the estate to Caelan and a council of trusted advisers Caelan had helped him establish. He spent more time in the castle library, a room he had initially avoided as it felt like another trapping of his false identity. But he found a strange comfort in the old manuscripts, in the stories of other lives, other struggles. He read of kings and peasants, of wars and famines, of betrayals and unlikely loyalties. His own story, he thought, was perhaps not so unique in its strangeness, only in its specific, brutal details. He found himself often thinking of Alara. She was aging too, her once nimble fingers now gnarled with arthritis, but her eyes still held that clear, compassionate light. He would send for her, not for any ailment, but simply to talk, to sit by the fire and share a comfortable silence. She was the only person alive who knew the entirety of him, both Thomas Fletcher and Alaric Ashworth. With her, he didn't have to act. He didn't have to pretend. "Do you ever regret it, Alara?" he asked her one winter afternoon, the wind howling outside the thick castle walls. "That day in the forest, tying your fate to mine." She smiled, a faint, wistful expression. "Regret, Thomas? No, I did what I thought was right, in a moment when there were no easy choices. You were a dying man. And Sir Caelan, he was a man presented with an unexpected path. We all make choices and live with their echoes." She looked at him. "Have you regretted it, being Alaric Ashworth?" He considered this. "Sometimes," he admitted, "the lie has been a heavy cloak, and the power, it is a corrupting thing, even when one tries to wield it fairly." He sighed. "But Thomas Fletcher would have died in that forest or on a gallows long ago. Alaric Ashworth, he has lived. He has, perhaps, even done some small good for these people, these lands. Is that enough to balance the scales?" Alara placed her wrinkled hand on his. "Only God can judge the scales, Thomas. You have lived the life you were given, however strangely it came to you, and you have borne its burdens with more honour than many born to true nobility." Her words were a comfort, though the deep-seated guilt never entirely left him. The end came peacefully, as such things rarely did for men of his original profession. He was in his bed, the cold of a late autumn seeping into his old bones. Caelan was there, a silent, stoic sentinel. Alara sat by his side, holding his hand, her presence a calm reassurance in the encroaching darkness. He looked at Caelan. "The lands, they are secure," he rasped, his voice weak. "They are, my lord," Caelan affirmed. "The succession is clear. There will be peace." Thomas nodded, a flicker of satisfaction in his fading eyes. He had held the line. He had maintained the illusion, and in doing so had perhaps brought a measure of stability that a true, perhaps weaker Ashworth heir might not have managed. His gaze shifted to Alara. "Thank you," he whispered, the words encompassing a lifetime of gratitude for her courage, her compassion, her unwavering friendship. She squeezed his hand, tears welling in her eyes. "Rest now, Thomas," she said softly, using the name that only she still dared, the name that was, in the deepest recesses of his soul, still his own. He closed his eyes. The face of his father, young and hopeful before the ruins, swam into his vision. Then the scent of herbs, the warmth of Alara's cottage. The cold steel of his dagger, the roar of flames consuming a ledger. So many lives, so many lies. With a final, shuddering breath, Thomas Fletcher, known to the world as Lord Alaric Ashworth, let go. His funeral was even grander than his father's. The new Lord Ashworth, Isolde's grandson, a young man eager to prove himself, ensured all due honours were paid to the man who had, against all expectations, held the Ashworth legacy together. Bards sang of the miraculous return of Alaric Ashworth, of his wisdom and his quiet strength. No one sang of Thomas Fletcher, the desperate peasant, the disgraced soldier, the ex-thief with decent aim, the man so far off society's radar he could kill and still not be noticed. Caelan stood impassively through the eulogies, his face a mask of martial grief. Only he and Alara knew the true, astonishing depth of the irony. He had served Thomas Fletcher, the assassin, as faithfully as he would have served any true-born lord, perhaps more so, bound by their shared secret and the pragmatic necessities of power. He had gambled on a nobody and, in doing so, had secured the future of Ashworth. Alara wept quietly, not for Lord Alaric Ashworth, but for Thomas Fletcher, the lost soul she had tried to save, the man who had carried the weight of 2 lives and found a strange, bitter kind of redemption in the heart of a lie. In the grand sweep of history, Lord Alaric Ashworth would be remembered as a footnote, a curious tale of a lost son returned. The truth of Thomas Fletcher, the desperate man who crept through castle halls and darkened alleys, the man who had briefly changed history with a blade and a whisper before being thrust into a role he never sought, was buried deeper than any corpse, lost to the indifferent winds of time. His was a story that would never be told. A testament to the grim, dangerous, and not-so-glamorous world he had briefly, and so improbably transcended, only to find himself in a gilded cage of his own unlikely making. The shadows had claimed him once, and in the end they claimed him again, leaving only the legend and the silence. The new Lord Ashworth, young Lord Philip, Isolde's grandson, proved to be a competent, if somewhat unimaginative, ruler. He leaned heavily on Sir Caelan's experience in the initial years, the old knight serving as a bridge between the enigmatic reign of Alaric and the more conventional lordship Philip intended to establish. The transition was smooth, a testament to the stability Thomas and Caelan had painstakingly built. Caelan, his duty done, retired a few years into Philip's lordship, a man finally allowing himself the luxury of age. He retreated to a small manor granted to him for his long service, his days spent not with swords and strategies, but with hounds and hawks. He never spoke of Thomas Fletcher, nor of the intricacies of Alaric Ashworth's miraculous return. Some secrets, he knew, were pillars holding up the very structure of peace. To disturb them was to invite chaos. His silence was his final service. Alara lived out her days in Oak Hollow, her cottage a sanctuary of healing and quiet wisdom. Villagers would sometimes speak in hushed tones of the strange Lord Alaric, the one who had seemed to understand their hardships, the one who had a peculiar friendship with their herbalist. They wove their own myths around him, as people often do with those who are different, those who carry an air of unspoken sorrow or hidden depths. Alara listened to their tales, a gentle smile on her lips, never correcting, never revealing the far stranger truth she held in her heart. The ledger, consumed by fire, was truly gone. Its secrets were ash. But the effects of those secrets, the ripples they had sent through lives and legacies, lingered in the quiet corners of Ashworth history. The alliances shifted, the old enmities soothed or redirected, all because of a book of names and numbers and the desperate actions of men and women caught in its orbit. Sometimes on clear nights Alara would look up at Ashworth Castle, its stone silhouette dark against the starry sky. She would think of Thomas Fletcher, the desperate man who had stumbled to her door, and Lord Alaric Ashworth, the improbable lord who had died in a soft bed. 2 men in one, a life forged in the crucible of lies, yet lived with a strange, fierce integrity. She wondered if, in some other, kinder world, Thomas Fletcher might have found peace without the charade, without the blood. But their world had not been kind, and peace was a rare, often ill-gotten commodity. She kept the small, crudely carved wooden swift, her brother's, the one that had inadvertently sparked a desperate lie and changed so many fates, tucked away in a small wooden box with her most precious herbs. It was a reminder, a memento of a desperate gamble, of a life saved, and a life irrevocably altered, a symbol of hope and safe journeys that had, in its own twisted way, led a lost soul through the darkest of forests. And so the story of Thomas Fletcher, the medieval assassin who became Lord Alaric Ashworth, dissolved into the unwritten annals of the past. His true identity remained the deepest secret, known only to the dead and the dying. The official histories would record Lord Alaric as a strange but effective ruler, a man who appeared from nowhere and held his lands with a quiet strength. The mythbusters of later eras, had they ever stumbled upon the fragmented clues, would have found only contradictions, dead ends, and the impenetrable silence of those who had taken the truth to their graves. The grim, dangerous, and not-so-glamorous world of medieval assassins had produced many such phantoms, many footnotes that made everyone nervous and probably didn't live to enjoy the coin. Thomas Fletcher had been one of them, chewed up and spat out, wearing a hood and holding a rusty dagger. But fate, in its most bizarre and unpredictable fashion, had spat him out a second time, cloaked in nobility and burdened with a stolen name. He hadn't been the hero. He hadn't even in the end been the villain of his own story. He had simply been a man, desperate and flawed, who had navigated an impossible path with a survivor's tenacity, leaving behind a legacy far stranger and perhaps more enduring than he could ever have imagined. The silence that followed him was not one of erasure, but of a story too complex, too dangerous, too improbable to ever be fully told. And in that silence the true essence of his grim, unglamorous, and utterly unique existence finally found its rest. Years later, long after Alara and Caelan had passed, a young scholar sifting through the dusty archives of Ashworth Castle came across a curious entry in an old estate ledger from the time of Lord Philip. It was a small, recurring payment, authorised by Philip's grandfather, Lord Alaric, to the village of Oak Hollow, specifically for the upkeep of the herbalist's cottage and a yearly tithe to the small chapel there, in gratitude for services rendered. The scholar found it odd. Lord Alaric had been known for his fiscal prudence, almost to a fault. Such sentimental gestures were out of character with the stern, enigmatic image that had been passed down. He also found, tucked away in a collection of Caelan's old campaign journals, a brief, uncharacteristically reflective passage. Some men are forged in fire, others in shadow. The strongest steel is often that which has known both. The falcon may fly high, but it remembers the swift's desperate flight. The scholar puzzled over these fragments, these faint echoes of a story he could not piece together. He noted them down as minor curiosities, anomalies in the otherwise straightforward record of Ashworth lordship. He could not know that these were the last, fading whispers of Thomas Fletcher the assassin, of Alara, the compassionate healer, and of Sir Caelan, the pragmatic knight who had orchestrated a lie to preserve an order. The truth remained elusive, as truths often do when buried under layers of time, expediency, and deliberate silence. The great tapestry of history had absorbed the errant threads of Thomas Fletcher's life, weaving them into the larger pattern in such a way that they became indistinguishable from the whole, their original darker colour hidden from view. The world moved on. New lords came and went, wars were fought, plagues swept through, and the stones of Ashworth Castle weathered the centuries, silent witnesses to the lives and secrets they had sheltered. The name of Thomas Fletcher was utterly forgotten, a ghost unremembered. The name of Lord Alaric Ashworth became a minor legend, a story told to children of a lost son returned, a lord who was stern but just, and perhaps that was the most fitting epitaph for a man like Thomas. For an assassin, the greatest success was to vanish, to leave no trace. In a way, he had achieved that, albeit by becoming someone else entirely. The grim, thankless, short-lived career he had been thrust into had, through a bizarre alchemy of fate, transformed into something else. The power had come without peace, the purpose without a true place in the world, just as the original narrator had foretold. But he had endured. He had adapted. He had, in his own deeply compromised way, survived. The soft background hum of history, like the fan in a darkened room, continued its ceaseless drone, carrying away the whispers of forgotten lives, of desperate choices, of improbable survivals. And in that hum, the story of the sick goat herder with something to hide, the man who landed on the life-went-horribly-wrong train and ended up wearing a lord's robes instead of a hood and a rusty dagger, finally, truly, came to its silent, unremarked end. And in that hum, the story of the sick goat herder with something to hide, the man who landed on the life-went-horribly-wrong train and ended up wearing a lord's robes instead of a hood and a rusty dagger, finally, truly, came to its mouth. His was not a tale for the minstrels or the chroniclers, but for the quiet contemplation of the few who might stumble upon its faintest traces and wonder at the strange, twisting paths a human life could take in the grim, dangerous, and not so glamorous world of the past. The scholar, whose name was Brother Thomas, a common enough name holding no particular echo for him of the man whose faint traces he had uncovered, eventually moved on from the Ashworth archives. He carried with him a sense of an untold story, a faint dissatisfaction that the records felt incomplete, as if a vital chapter had been deliberately excised or deeply encoded. But other historical puzzles beckoned, other lords and ladies, other battles and betrayals. The mystery of Lord Alaric's unusual charity and Caelan's cryptic journal entry remained just that, a minor unsolved riddle in the vast expanse of the past. And so Ashworth Castle stood, generation after generation, its stones holding the silent testament to the lives enacted within its walls. The wind that whistled through its battlements carried no names, no confessions. The rains washed the stones clean, season after season, just as time washed away the sharp edges of memory, leaving only the smoothed contours of legend. If one were to walk the halls of Ashworth today, or what remains of them, perhaps as a tourist listening to a guide's rehearsed speech, they would hear of the noble Ashworth line, of battles fought and alliances forged. They might hear the curious tale of the lost son, Alaric, who returned after many years, a man changed by hardship, but ultimately a strong ruler. There would be no mention of a desperate peasant named Thomas Fletcher, no hint of a life stolen or a murder committed in the dead of night in Oak Haven. There would be no whisper of a ledger filled with damning secrets, nor of its dramatic immolation in a castle hearth. The truth, as it so often does, had become a ghost story without a ghost, a crime without a perpetrator named, a salvation without its true saviour or its true victim acknowledged. It had become simply history, a collection of accepted facts, convenient omissions, and the enduring power of a well-maintained narrative. The niche world of the medieval assassin, as described with such grim accuracy, had indeed claimed Thomas Fletcher. It had chewed him up, but in an extraordinary deviation from the norm, it had spat him out, not as a footnote, but as a replacement, a changeling lord. He had not escaped the core truths of that shadowed existence, the constant fear, the isolation, even amidst a castle full of people, the knowledge that his life was built on a knife's edge. But he had, through an almost unbelievable confluence of luck, desperation, and the calculated machinations of others, managed to navigate it for far longer than any of his kind could have ever hoped. His story serves as a peculiar addendum to the brutal rules of his former profession. No glory, no pension, no evenings off, all true. But for one Thomas Fletcher, there was an unexpected, perilous, and ultimately all-consuming second act, played out on a stage he never auditioned for, in a role he was never meant to have. And in the grand, indifferent silence that followed his final curtain, perhaps that was the most astonishing trick of all. Not just to survive, but to be remembered, however falsely, as someone else entirely. The ultimate act of vanishing, not into the shadows, but into the very fabric of a stolen life. The final, lingering irony, perhaps, was that Thomas Fletcher, in becoming Alaric Ashworth, had, in a way, fulfilled one of the unspoken desires of many who found themselves on that life-went-horribly-wrong train, the desire to be someone else, anyone else, to escape the crushing weight of their own desperate circumstances. He had achieved it, though the price was a different kind of crushing weight, the burden of a perpetual lie, the constant vigilance against exposure, the knowledge that his entire existence was a performance. The soft background hum the original narrator had invited his audience to create, that gentle sound of a fan easing one into a journey, had for Thomas become the ceaseless, low thrum of anxiety that underscored every moment of his noble charade. The journey he had been eased into was far stranger and more protracted than the typical assassin's quick descent into oblivion. His was not a story that would ever burst the myth wide open in the public consciousness, because his truth was too specific, too hidden. He became part of a different myth, the myth of the returned noble, the prodigal son. He reinforced a narrative of hope and miraculous restoration, even as his internal reality was a testament to the grim truths he had once embodied. And so, the cycle continued. History would be written by the victors, the survivors, and those who controlled the narrative. The Thomas Fletchers of the world would remain largely unrecorded, their desperate lives and brutal deaths serving as cautionary tales whispered in the dark, or as fodder for romanticized fictions that bore little resemblance to their harsh reality. But for a brief, improbable span of time, one such man had slipped through the cracks of fate. He had not changed the system. He had not brought about an age of justice or enlightenment. He had simply, through an extraordinary series of events, survived his designated role and been thrust into another. He had exchanged one set of shadows for another, more gilded, but no less treacherous. The lights, dimmed at the beginning of that long-ago telling, could now, metaphorically, be brought up. The journey through the grim world of medieval assassins and through the even stranger singular path of Thomas Fletcher was complete. What remained was the echo of a life lived against impossible odds, a testament to the enduring human capacity for adaptation, deception, and survival, even when the world itself seemed designed to crush the individual spirit. The fan could be turned off. The silence that followed was filled only with the weight of a story that, in its truest sense, could never truly be told, only lived, and then, inevitably forgotten.